Typically, when you go through something so traumatic and horrifying, your mind has a way to block those events to keep you from further suffering. However, I remember the events as if it was yesterday. It was a brisk October day with orange and brown leaves littering the streets and sidewalks. The temperature was a perfect chill to where you could almost see your breath. I would be going on a scout trip with my troop and some friends from school who weren't scouts but still wanted to come on the trip despite making fun of me for being in the Boy Scouts. The trip was a 10-mile hike round trip, 2 nights and 3 days. This took place back in the early 90s before the internet was on everyone's cell phone and technology took over our lives. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy the modern conveniences that technology provides, but it also took away some personal feeling from the world. Mr. Dawson was our scoutmaster. He was an old man that looked jolly but was anything but. He wore suspenders since most belts were not able to accommodate his spare tire. He had a grizzly white beard that had streaks of gray in it, and almost always wore an Indiana Jones-styled hat. He was a tough man and rather strong for both his age and appearance. Despite him being an old miser to just about anyone, he did love scouting and raising boys and turning them into men. Alongside Mr. Dawson, we had an assistant scoutmaster who was more understanding when it came to the youth. Mr. Carlson was a younger man in his late 30s who wore big old glasses and always tucked his shirt in, no matter what type of pants he was wearing. I think Mr. Carlson was an accountant of some kind, but he was always a party. We all loved him. Thankfully, having both leaders made our troop very well-rounded, with both growing experiences and also fun ones. Mr. Dawson was retired and divorced. I think he had 1 or maybe 2 children, but he never spoke of them. As unfortunate as that was, he almost always came on all the scout trips, while Mr. Carlson could only come on some of them. Mr. Carlson and his wife were members of my church, and they recently had a child. This would require Mr. Carlson to sometimes stay back and help with the baby. On this trip, however, Mr. Carlson would miss the first night, but hike up on the second day and meet up with us. Apparently, Mr. Dawson had an old friend that had a cabin somewhere, and he allowed the troop to stay there for a couple of nights. The troop, as well as myself and my school friends, were very excited. We have never been on a hike this long before. Normally, if we were lucky and none of the parents volunteered to come, Mr. Dawson would let us shoot his 9mm pistol that he would carry on his suspenders while camping. He also carried a double-barrel shotgun in the back window of his truck, but he never let us shoot it. We all met at the parking lot after school, down at the local grocery store where Mr. Dawson's old green truck sat idling. He sat inside smoking cigarettes. He was a smoker but never smoked near us. The troop trickled in over the next 15 minutes, including Mr. Carlson in his old Honda minivan. He only came for this night since we needed the extra seats to drive all the scouts up to the campgrounds. Once all the scouts arrived, we loaded all of our bags into Mr. Dawson's truck bed and divided the scouts into both vehicles. My friends and I preferred riding with Mr. Carlson. The younger scouts, as well as some of the outcasts, were subjected to Mr. Dawson's truck, where he only listened to political talk radio and talked about old war stories that were not very interesting. We caravanned both vehicles loaded to the brim with both scouts and materials to the local campgrounds on the outskirts of town. We were kind of in a hurry since we were in a race against time to get to the cabin before the darkness fell. But we had plenty of daylight if things went to plan, which in scouting, they never do. Mr. Carlson dropped us off with some of our stuff and told us that he'd be up there the next day with some peach cobbler. His peach cobbler was a hit with everyone and brought even a smile to the old grumpy Mr. Dawson. We set off to the cabin in which Mr. Dawson instructed that the 2 oldest scouts to guide us there using an old map and a compass. Mr. Dawson led up the rear to make sure that none of the scouts didn't venture off the path or fall behind. The thing about Mr. Dawson is that he knew the way to the cabin, He had been there multiple times, in fact, but he wanted to give the scouts an opportunity to earn the orientation merit badge. For him to do that, he was not going to interfere unless it was getting too late or someone was hurt. Unfortunately, we had plenty of time before the sun was going to set, and the 2 scouts leading us were not geographically inclined. The 2 scouts began leading us, and the rest did not contribute anything constructive in terms of directions, but we did liven the spirits with talks of sports and jokes. Mr. Dawson remained quiet. The path at first was clearly laid out and had signs for the first bit, but the further we went into the dense forest, the more things began to blend in. We finally came to a fork in the path. There was no sign signaling which way was north, which is where the cabin was. The 2 scouts tried using the compass, but both paths seemed to be going either northwest or northeast. After 2 minutes of exchanging the map between the 2 scouts, one of them spoke up and asked Mr. Dawson for a hint. He shrugged and chuckled. "I'm not the one getting the merit badge. If you want it, you gotta get us to the cabin before it gets dark," he said in his old southern accent. The scouts ahead of us eventually picked the path to the right. We continued hiking, but this time we were less sure of where we were going. Our packs began to feel heavy, and despite the cool air, I for one was beginning to sweat. It was around this time that the noise in the forest began to have a strange eeriness to it. The birds that were still out this time of year didn't seem to favor this part of the forest. My anxiety was climbing, more so from being lost rather than the change in environment that we were now entering. The path began to take a significant incline as we ventured further in. It was at this moment that we all began to hear a very strange sound. It was distant but familiar. My mind immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. It sounded like someone crying out in the woods. The scouts and even the leader began to slow down as we didn't know what to do. The closer we got, the more we realized that this crying was coming off the path and into the woods. We could see not too far off that there was an old decaying cabin that seemed to be the source of the noise. Normally, most people would ignore this and continue on. Too many red flags. However, this was different. We were Boy Scouts, and we were supposed to help people. The cabin was the biggest concern. If it looked normal, then we would have left, but since it looked abandoned, then we had to make sure that there wasn't someone in trouble. At this point, Mr. Dawson got involved. "I'm gonna take 4 scouts and we're gonna go investigate. The rest of you scouts stay here so we don't lose the path." We all agreed, and he picked me and 3 other scouts to come with him. The cabin was covered in moss and the wood looked old and twisted. The frame itself was slanted and looked unsafe to enter. The sound was more clear and it sounded like an infant crying. Mr. Dawson did something that I'd never seen him do before. He unholstered his pistol and walked around the cabin perimeter, calling out to anyone inside. No one answered and the crying continued. He went into the cabin and we followed. It didn't take us long to find the source of the noise, and to our shock, we realized that it was coming from an old radio that wasn't plugged in. One of the scouts turned off the radio and asked, "How is this possible?" Mr. Dawson looked around with a look of attentiveness. "We need to leave," he said. Right then the radio came on again, but this time it wasn't the crying sound. It played this eerie tune that I'd never heard before. The sound was unlike the crying and was distorted and warped, much like the rest of the cabin. We tried turning it off, but we had no luck, so we just left. When we got back to the trail, we were questioned by the other scouts and asked what was going on, if there was a baby down there. We told them that it was just this old creepy radio that we couldn't turn off. As creepy as it was, none of us really paid it any mind, especially since the one camping trip where an old woman was tweaking on drugs out in the woods, and we had to get the police involved. That creepy music kept playing, and Mr. Dawson took us back down to the fork in the path and led us up the correct way to the cabin. The hike took a bit longer than we anticipated, but thankfully, the cabin was prepped for all of us, so all we had to do was unload our stuff and gather some firewood to start the dinner. The cabin was equipped with a fireplace stove, so we didn't have to build a fire circle and cook outside. This made us feel a false sense of security, especially after the incredibly odd situation that we had just encountered on the trail. It didn't take us long to gather all the firewood that we could possibly need for the trip, since there was a good number of us and we were all hungry. As we were gathering the firewood, the sun slowly began to creep behind the horizon, abandoning us to what horrors the night had to offer. We brought the firewood to the cabin, leaving most of it outside since it would have made a mess. Mr. Dawson was quick in starting the stove, and we were cooking in no time. The stove acted as a heat source for the cabin, which was nice, since the early autumn coolness was beginning to be more chilling in the evening. It took all of us a couple of minutes to be able to cook all of our food, due to the sheer amount of scouts and the limited size of the wood-burning stove. We made makeshift seats around the stove, and we enjoyed our meals as they came off the stove, one by one. As we were eating, we naturally began talking. We talked about events in our lives, school, sports, Bigfoot, whatever 12-year-olds talk about at that age. I can't remember who brought up the old radio. The atmosphere in the cabin went from a playful bliss to a more sobering, dreadful result. It wasn't so much the topic itself, but rather the theories surrounding the event. Why would a radio station be playing crying sounds? One of the scouts asked. I don't know of any station that just plays bizarre sounds. How was the radio even playing? It wasn't connected to a power source, and I didn't see it have batteries, another scout mentioned. Mr. Dawson, while cooking up his meal, mentioned that he had heard of things like this before, as a war tactic. Play a sound of someone in help, whether a comrade or a helpless child, and draw in the enemy into an unsafe area to ambush them. That explains why he walked around the old cabin with his gun out. We slowly shifted talking about theories of what could have been trapping us to scary stories. This was way before Creepypasta Wiki or horror channels on YouTube. The stories that we were sharing were either first-hand accounts of ghosts or cryptids out in the woods or abandoned buildings. We all took turns having the spotlight of telling scary stories when Mr. Dawson shared with us a truly terrifying story. It was when he was younger and helping his uncle move cattle across the open plains. He said it took them about a week or so to move all the cattle from one town to the other, where they would sell them in bulk. His job was to take a head count every night to keep track if they lost any cattle that day. If they lost any, then his uncle would go back and backtrack and try to find them during the night. All the cattle were equipped with very loud bells, which made finding them quite easy, but sleeping near them very difficult. On the first couple of days of the cattle drive, the company began to notice that at night, something would be disturbing the cattle into a small frenzy, causing everyone to be woken up by the commotion. After a quick investigation, they would find that one of the cows had been attacked by something with large claws and was still bleeding. The wound was so severe that the cow was bound to die, either from infection or blood loss, so they ended up putting it down. Mr. Dawson explained that he had never seen a wound like that before. His only thought was that it must have been a bear of some kind, but he had never seen or even heard of bears being in that area. He then explained that he found himself having a hard time trying to sleep outside, since he was exposed to whatever had injured that cow for the rest of the week. He had his theories on what he thought it could have been, but he wasn't for sure. The scout's eyes were wide and full of fear as the dim fire of the wood-burning stove began to slowly get lower. An unsettling silence fell on the group as they all considered the wide varieties of monsters and beasts that still could roam the open dark places of the world. Mr. Dawson then let out a shout to get the scouts to scream. The screams were shortly followed by laughter by both the scouts and the scoutmaster. The laughter eventually led to a silence as the scouts scoured their minds for the next scary story to share when they all began to hear a familiar tune, not too far off into the distance. The cabin provided a decent amount of soundproofing, however, the unnatural tune found its way slithering through the cracks and frame of the cabin like some old venomous serpent coming to bring ill tidings. It took the group only but a moment before dread had struck them all in the gut. The sound that they were hearing was the same song on the radio that they had encountered earlier that day. "Wait here, Mr. Dawson said while standing up, unholstering his pistol again and opening the cabin door. He wasn't out there long before he came back in. The eerie tune crept off into the night, out of earshot, yet the bad feelings that it dragged here remained. All of our ears strained to hear more of the music, but it was gone. Out of earshot, yet the bad feelings that it dragged here remained. All of our ears strained to hear more of the music, but it was gone. At this point of the evening, we decided the best thing to do was to stock up on firewood, keep it near the stove, but most importantly, keep the cabin door closed. Mr. Dawson took the only available room to sleep in while the rest of the scouts spread out their sleeping bags around the dim but still warm wood-burning stove. The smooth crackling of the fire provided a calming effect to our young minds. However, the treacherous evil we had encountered earlier still dwelled in the shadows of uncertainty. No amount of security could make us feel safe while out in these woods, but the locked cabin door would have to do. Our nightly routine of inappropriate jokes was sidetracked, as none of us wanted to disturb the quiet air that kept us hidden inside the cabin. Despite the high anxiety and fear that we all were experiencing, the 5 miles we hiked up to this cabin had taken its toll on us. Much like the fire in the stove, our minds slowly dwindled into darkness, and we all found ourselves fast asleep. I don't remember falling asleep, but I do remember waking up. It felt as if I hadn't even fallen asleep in the first place. The first thing that I noticed, before anything else, was it. Standing in the nearest window, roughly 4 feet away from me, was a gaunt creature. At first I thought it was an old man, but it didn't take long before I realized that it wasn't. Its skin was gray and wrinkled like the bark of an old tree. Its eyes were sunken like dark pits that had no end. I couldn't see the eyes themselves, but I could feel their icy gaze violate me as it scanned its unholy sight upon me. For the brief moment that I was the only one awake, this creature and I shared a tormenting few seconds of silence and fear. I was paralyzed, but I could tell that this thing was delighted, that I was petrified. It seemed to feed off my fear like some kind of grotesque parasite, latching itself to the most vulnerable part of my soul. I thought this would be the most horrific thing I'd ever have to encounter in my life, but I was wrong. The hideous creature that was only separated by a thin paned window began to do something horrifying. The silence was broken by the familiar singing of that eerie tune from earlier. This creature was now singing it loudly, while also trying to do what I could only assume to be dancing. The creature moved rigidly, like its body was stiff from decay. Its dancing almost felt like a taunt, like it had me right where it wanted me, and there was nothing I could do to escape the inevitable doom that was sure to come. The singing caused me to break the trance of fear and allowed me to finally scream to alert everyone else. All the scouts slowly woke from their blissful dreams that granted them ignorance to the horrors that laid outside. It didn't take them long to see what I was screaming at, and they also followed in screams of terror. Mr. Dawson was a heavy sleeper. Even with the screams of the scouts and the creature singing quite loudly, he lay tucked away in the other room. 2 of the scouts were brave enough to open the door to the other room and wake the old scoutmaster, to hopefully rid us of this terror. Once awake, the scoutmaster knew almost instantly what was going on. He hopped out of bed while only wearing his evening apparel, which consisted of some socks, old faded boxers, and a white t-shirt. He grabbed his pistol and made his way for the door. Our screams then turned to shouts and pleads to stay inside, but the old man was determined to do what he wanted. He unlocked the door, and before he opened it all the way, the creature stopped singing and rushed the door with an unnatural bolt of speed and fury that I'd never seen before. The door flung open, hitting poor Mr. Dawson right in the face, causing him to fall violently. The fall probably did more damage than the door, as he let out a loud huff of pain when he landed. His face streamed blood quite quickly, which soon began to run onto his t-shirt. Despite the door hitting him and having the wind knocked out of him, Mr. Dawson was able to sit upright and aim his pistol at the creature, whose figure now stood in the doorway. His aim, despite the blood obscuring his sight, was rather on the mark, as the gunshots briefly illuminated the cabin with flashes of orange light coming from the pistol. Chunks of the creature blew off, but the bullets didn't seem to faze the creature. The creature's quick burst of speed quickly closed the gap between itself and Mr. Dawson. The next thing we all knew, the creature's nails gripped into his head much like someone were to palm a basketball and lifted him off the ground. Mr. Dawson let out screams of pain as the creature then lifted the screaming scoutmaster, and then began slamming him down head first into the wooden floor. Mr. Dawson sustained 2 powerful hits before his screams were silenced. The creature continued until the floor began to break under the high force of slams. Once lifeless, the creature then dragged Mr. Dawson out of the cabin and off into the woods. All of the scouts were either screaming or crying. Our only leader, who was responsible for keeping us safe, had been viciously slammed into a pulp effortlessly, all right before our eyes. One of the older scouts jumped up and slammed the door shut while locking it. All the other scouts began to place furniture around the door to provide a barricade to our only line of defense of that creature. The hour was late in the night, but there was no chance that any of us were going to find sleep after this gruesome event that just unfolded in front of our innocent minds. It took the troop around a good 30 minutes before we began to calm down. It didn't dawn on us right then, but we eventually realized that our way back to town was a 5-mile hike in the very forest in which this creature lived. If we were to ever make it back out of here, we would eventually have to take the chance and hike back. An hour later, just when we thought things were going to be calm, we heard the same chilling tune off in the distance. Much like before, the creature was also dancing, except this time it began to twirl something. It had 2 items in each of its hands. The closer the creature got, the better we were able to see that the creature was twirling the arms of the scout leader that had been ripped off his body. The scouts began to scream again as the creature danced around the cabin. The creature wasn't trying to get inside the cabin. It was just taunting us again. The creature eventually threw the arms at the cabin, making a loud thud, and danced its way back into the woods. The sun eventually made its way back into our lives, as we spent the longest night of our lives waiting for the creature to come back to eat us. Once the sun came out, the creature had yet to make an appearance. The scouts began to theorize about the creature. Maybe it doesn't like light. Why does it sing that song? Is that a demon of some kind? These were the ideas that we all shared with one another. We finally came to the conclusion that the creature was a demon of some kind, from a dark place, and that it didn't like light. That's why we hadn't seen it since the sun came up. We finally came up with a plan to get out of here. We were going to split up into 2 groups and hike back. If the creature were to get one group, then the other would have a chance to get away. As we were getting our plans all figured out, we saw someone come out of the woodline. With the events of last night, we had all forgotten about Mr. Carlson coming up today. Mr. Carlson came walking towards the cabin while carrying all his stuff when another figure appeared behind him. Mr. Carlson was about 30 yards away from the cabin and was in the middle of us and the other figure in the woods. We all began to scream for him to run to us as we tried unblocking the door, for all the furniture was still there. To our surprise, the figure behind Mr. Carlson was Mr. Dawson. For a brief moment, we were all very confused to what we were seeing. Did Mr. Dawson survive the attack from the creature? Mr. Carlson stopped as he turned around to see Mr. Dawson standing in the woodline. Our shouts must have been muffled by the cabin as he seemed to ignore us and walk over to Mr. Dawson. Once we were able to get the cabin door unblocked, we were finally able to yell at Mr. Carlson to tell him to run to us. In response, Mr. Dawson began to dance and sing much like the creature we encountered earlier. This wasn't Mr. Dawson. It was the creature imitating him. We all left the cabin and sprinted to Mr. Carlson to pull him inside, but the creature began to transform back into that hideous form. Mr. Carlson watched in horror as Mr. Dawson transformed into the most terrifying beast he had ever seen. Like before, the creature grabbed the head of Mr. Carlson and dragged him off into the woods, as Mr. Carlson screamed for his life. Some of us took the opportunity to run back into the trail and hopefully make it back while others ran back to the cabin. My fear overtook my body as my mind instinctively ran on the trail leading back into town. The 5 miles went by quickly as my adrenaline carried me most of the way back. Once I reached the base of the trail, my adrenaline had been flushed from my body, as well as the handful of scouts that had followed me, and we collapsed in front of a family that was unloading a minivan for a hike. We were somehow able to find the strength to scream at them that our scout leaders were dead and that they should call the police. The police came and rounded up the scouts that made it back and questioned us about where the cabin was. We gave them the correct information and made their way off into the woods, while the paramedics took us to the hospital. The remaining scouts that stayed back in the cabin were found inside. All of them had been killed. The door had been broken down and their bodies thrown about. They had no leads on who or what had did this, and they ended up closing that part of the trail that led to the cabin. I haven't been back in those woods since. Not just those woods, but any woods in general. My warning goes out to those of you who might find themselves in the woods this time of year. If you hear crying, just turn back. Nothing good will happen if you investigate.